Behind Red Bull in 2023, we have had a season-long battle between Mercedes, Ferrari, McLaren and Aston Martin for who had the second best car in Formula 1. Now, with all 22 races over, I thought it would be a fun experiment to look back and assign for each race what the second fastest car was, and see which team, in my opinion, had the strongest car behind Red Bull for most races. And now, my method of deciding what the second best car was during a specific race is based primarily on race pace, but also qualifying pace from both of the drivers. It's one thing to have a fast car during the race, but if the drivers are constantly struggling to qualify it well, then they're always going to be on a recovery drive, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the best car overall. Also, just to clear up any confusion, for the rest of the video, when I refer to the best or the quickest car, I'm obviously excluding the Red Bull because it just saves me the hassle of constantly clarifying that I mean the second fastest or second best. I'll also say that throughout the season, the car that I have deemed as the best didn't always finish as the highest placed behind Max and Red Bull, and that is a great segue onto the first race of the season in Bahrain. Despite the fact that Alonso on his Aston Martin debut got all of the plaudits for finishing on the podium, it was actually Ferrari who had the best car. Leclerc and Sainz qualified 3rd and 4th, 3/10 ahead of Aston Martin and Mercedes, and in the race, despite Alonso overtaking Sainz late on, at the point that Leclerc retired with 16 laps to go and having done all of his pit stops, he was over 11 seconds ahead of Alonso. Even if perhaps the Aston Martin was slightly better during the race, Leclerc absolutely had the pace and the gap to hold off Alonso for the podium, and it was only their reliability that cost them. In Jeddah with Max out of the picture due to a driveshaft issue in qualifying, it was Leclerc who qualified second. But Ferrari's reliability came back to bite them yet again, as despite it being just the second race of the season, Leclerc ended up starting in P12 due to a grid penalty. Despite that, the best car in my opinion was the Aston Martin. Fernando qualified just behind Charles and was then promoted onto the front row, and despite having a 5-second time penalty for a grid box issue, it was clear that in the hands of both Alonso and Stroll, the Aston Martin was stronger in the race than both the Ferrari and Mercedes. Australia is a fairly simple one. Mercedes were quick in qualifying with Russell in second and Hamilton in third, and although George suffered a reliability issue during the race, Hamilton still delivered on their pace with second in the race. In Azerbaijan, both Leclerc and Sainz finished in the top 5 in every single competitive session. Leclerc made it back-to-back poles in quali and sprint quali, and then held off a strong Fernando Alonso to finish third behind the Red Bulls. Over one lap, it was close between the Aston Martin and the Ferrari despite Leclerc's crash, but Ferrari didn't quite have the same race pace with Alonso comfortably fastest in the Aston Martin. Monaco was a chaotic weekend with a fantastic qualifying, mixed conditions in the race, multiple drivers in the barrier, and although again Ferrari were very close in qualifying, Alonso in the Aston Martin maximised his weekend qualifying second and then finishing second behind Max. Despite a crazy qualifying with Russell out in Q2, which actually throughout the season became a bit of a theme for the Mercedes drivers, after their side pod update in Monaco and similar to last year, Mercedes had a clear advantage in the race around Catalonia. After qualifying in 5th and 12th, both of the drivers recovered to finish on the podium with a Mercedes 2-3. This weekend was very close between Aston Martin and Mercedes. Alonso and Hamilton lined up side by side on the second row, and although Hamilton jumped Alonso at the start, it took Alonso just 22 laps to get back past, finishing in second place, 5 seconds ahead of Lewis. Austria was the beginning of McLaren's season with their big upgrades, even surprising Lando with how much they improved the car, but it was still Ferrari who had the better car. Leclerc and Sainz qualified 2nd and 3rd, and then went on to finish 2nd and 4th on the road, before Sainz was hit with a post-race 10-second time penalty for track limits. In Silverstone, it was all papaya. Lando and Oscar qualified 2nd and 3rd, Lando even jumped Max at the beginning and led for a very small portion of the race, which was really fun to watch as I was lucky enough to be there, and it was only a late safety car that denied Oscar and McLaren a double podium. Despite Lando finishing as the highest placed driver, Mercedes to me had the best car. Qualifying was a total mixed bag, with Russell knocked out in Q1 due to traffic, and Lewis on pole position for his first and only of the season. In the race, Russell climbed from 18th to 6th ahead of both of the Ferraris, whilst Lewis had a nightmare first lap, dropping to 4th. Although he was slow at the start, during his final stint, he was one of the quickest drivers on the track, and even Toto after the race admitted to Mercedes losing out, despite having arguably the quicker car compared to McLaren. In the wet, McLaren had incredible pace, with Piastri finishing on the podium in the sprint, but this weekend was all about Leclerc and Ferrari. Leclerc qualified second and then finished third behind both of the Red Bulls, and said after the race that he was very comfortable and very happy with the performance all weekend long. A weekend of missed opportunities. McLaren to me had the best car in Zandvoort, with Lando qualifying on the front row with Max, albeit Max was half a second quicker, but then McLaren along with Mercedes had an absolute howler on the strategy side, leaving all of their drivers out for far too long on the slicks as the rain came in. In the end, it was Alonso and Gasly who benefited, finishing on the podium. Monza and Singapore was back-to-back delight for Ferrari. In Monza, Sainz and Leclerc battling for the podium finished more than 10 seconds ahead of next best George Russell, and then in Singapore, Sainz, with the help of Leclerc in the race, executed a perfect weekend with 1-2 on the grid, and then securing the win in the only race of the season where Red Bull were off the pace. Suzuka and Qatar was back-to-back delight for McLaren this time. In Japan, they absolutely dominated with second and third in qualifying, and then second and third in the race. But in Qatar, it almost could have been very, very different. Although they maximised in the sprint, qualifying 1-2 and then finishing 1-3 with Piastri winning his first sprint race, both of the drivers admitted to making mistakes and under-delivering in actual qualifying, starting in 6th and 10th, with Lando even believing that pole position was on the table. Mercedes were close enough that had it not have been for Hamilton crashing into Russell, they probably would have beaten McLaren to the podium with both of their drivers. As it were, Mercedes taking each other out allowed McLaren to get back to where they really should have been in the first place, as they delivered on their pace with second and third in the race. The US and Mexico really was a case of Ferrari being fastest over one lap, but Mercedes having the superior and better race car. In Austin, over one lap, the gaps were unbelievably tight, with just 1/10 separating Leclerc, Norris and Hamilton. But even from the sprint, we knew what was coming, as in the race, it was Lewis who overtook everyone and pushed Max all the way for the win, eventually finishing in P2, before being disqualified after the race with Leclerc. In Mexico, once again, Ferrari were unreal over one lap, qualifying 1-2, but Mercedes was stronger in the race, with Lewis once again bringing home that P2. Although it must be said, McLaren and specifically Lando's pace during the race was incredible. As he himself said, had he not made a mistake which knocked him out of Q1, I think that him and Lewis would have been fighting for that podium. Lando made up for his mistake with probably his best overall weekend in Sao Paulo. Although he again didn't put everything together in qualifying for the race, he managed to qualify on pole for the sprint, finishing second, and then in the race the McLaren was the dominant car, as at one point Lando was even pushing Max for the win, and in the end finished 26 seconds ahead of Fernando in third. The back end of the season was all Forza Ferrari. In Vegas, Leclerc was quickest in every single qualifying session on his way to a Ferrari 1-2, and in the race he genuinely could have won the Grand Prix had it not have been for the timing of the safety car after Max and George collided. Or whilst the win wasn't on the table in Abu Dhabi, Ferrari and Leclerc executed a really strong weekend with P2 in qualifying and P2 in the race. Having said that, McLaren and Mercedes were still very close, but overall Mercedes just wasn't as quick in qualifying, with Russell in P3 and Hamilton out in Q2, and McLaren also underdelivered in qualifying, with Lando making a mistake on his final Q3 run, and then both of the McLaren drivers lacked a little bit of pace in the race. So that was the rundown of every single race, and for those that weren't keeping score, in reverse order I have Aston Martin having the best car 4 times, Mercedes and McLaren with 5 each, and Ferrari with 8. Looking back, I think it's fair to say that you can look at any of those teams and find multiple races where they left points on the table, either through driver errors in qualifying or the race, team errors with strategy or pit stops, and reliability going against them. With the margins being so close in 2023 between them, every single mistake and lost point was magnified, which put the emphasis on consistency even more. My main takeaways from this fun little experiment is that, firstly, I think I respect Mercedes and Lewis's consistent contributions across the entire season even more now. And secondly, given that in the other Mercedes Russell didn't exactly match Hamilton when it mattered, whilst both Leclerc and Sainz were a lot closer to each other, Ferrari on paper had the second best car for long enough that they really should have finished second in the Constructors. But reliability hurt them a lot with issues in Bahrain, Saudi, Brazil, and Qatar. I also think McLaren left a lot more points on the table than perhaps I first remembered, which didn't cost them in the end this season, but they definitely need to tighten up on some of those mistakes if they want to fight at the sharp end next season. And when it comes to Aston Martin, all of their problems can be summed up with a lack of development and Lance Stroll. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.